1. Art. Art is a sacred lie. 2. The discovery. Our soul discovers itself when we come into contact with a great mind. It is not until I had realized the infinitude of Goethe's imagination that I discovered the narrow breadth of my own. 3. Human intellect. Human intellect is nature's attempt at self-criticism. 4. The economics of charity. The charitable man really helps the non-charitable, not the indigent. For what is given to the poor is virtually given away to those who do not give anything to the poor. The non-charitable, therefore, are kept in their state of non-benevolence, and the benevolent man pays for them. This is the economics of charity. 5. The existence of God. My friends often ask me, do you believe in the existence of God? I think I am entitled to know the meaning of the terms used in this question before I answer it. My friends ought to explain to me what they mean by believe, existence and God, especially by the last two, if they want an answer to their question. I confess I do not understand these terms, and whenever I cross-examine them I find that they do not understand them either. 6. A dialogue. Heart. It is absolutely certain that God does exist. Head. But, my dear boy, existence is one of my categories, and you have no right to use it. Heart. So much the better, my Aristotle. 7. The satisfaction of vanity. The satisfaction of vanity has an economic value with us. Call me sub-assistant surgeon instead of hospital assistant, and I am quite contented even if you do not increase my salary. 8. Cruel psychology. Excuse me, a bit of cruel psychology. You fail in your enterprise, and now you wish to leave your home and try your luck in other climes. It is not because your ambition has received a fresh spur from your failure, but chiefly because you wish to hide your face from those who have witnessed your failure. Asterisk. This reflection was published in New Era, Lucknow, in 1917. It was reworded as, when we fail in an enterprise we feel inclined to leave our home and try our luck in alien climes. If such is your situation, study your soul closely before deciding one way or the other. Is it because your ambition has received a fresh spur from your failure, or because you wish to hide your face from those who have witnessed your failure? Excuse this bit of cruel psychology. Cas. 9. The power of belief. Belief is a great power. When I see that a proposition of mine is believed by another mind, my own conviction of its truth is thereby immensely increased. 10. The God of Islam. Christianity describes God as love, Islam as power. How shall we decide between the two conceptions? I think the history of mankind and of the universe as a whole must tell us as to which of the two conceptions is truer. I find that God reveals himself in history more as power than love. I do not deny the love of God, I mean that, on the basis of our historical experience, God is better described as power. 11. Hegel's system of philosophy. Hegel's system of philosophy is an epic poem in prose. 12. May 15, 1910. May 15, 1910, yesterday morning at about 4, I saw that glorious visitor of our hemisphere known as Halley's comet. Once in 75 years this superb swimmer of infinite space appears on our skies. It is only with the eyes of my grandsons that I shall see it again. The state of my mind was quite unique. I felt as if something indescribably vast had been closed up within the narrow limits of my clay, yet the thought that I could not see this wanderer again brought home to me the painful fact of my littleness. For the moment all ambition was killed in me. 13. Forms of government. Let fools fight for the forms of government, says Alexander Pope. I cannot agree with this political philosophy. To my mind, government, whatever its form, is one of the determining forces of a people's character. Loss of political power is equally ruinous to nations' character. Ever since their political fall, the Musulman's error, bookmark not defined, of India have undergone a rapid ethical deterioration. Of all the Muslim communities of the world, they are probably the meanest in point of character. I do not mean to deplore our former greatness in this country, for, I confess, I am almost a fatalist in regard to the various forces that ultimately decide the destinies of nations. As a political force we are perhaps no longer required, but we are, I believe, still indispensable to the world as the only testimony to the absolute unity of God. Our value among nations, then, is purely evidential. 14. Poetry and logical truth. It is idle to seek logical truth in poetry. The ideal of imagination is beauty, not truth. Do not then try to show a poet's greatness by quoting passages from his works, which, in your opinion, embody scientific truth. 15. Personal immortality. Personal immortality is not a state, it is a process. I think the distinction of spirit and body has done a lot of harm. Several religious systems have been based on this erroneous distinction. Man is essentially an energy, a force, or rather a combination of forces which admit of various arrangements. One definite arrangement of these forces is personality. Whether it is a purely chance arrangement does not concern me here. I accept it as a fact among other facts of nature, and try to find out whether this arrangement of forces, so dear to us, can continue as it is. Is it then possible that these forces should continue to work in the same direction as they are working in a living, healthy personality? I think it is. Let human personality be represented by a circle, which is only another way of saying that these forces result in describing a definite circle, which may be obliterated by an upsettle of the arrangement of forces constituting it. How then can we manage to secure the continuance of this circle? Evidently, by energizing in a way calculated to assist the constitutive forces in their regular routine of work. You must give up all those modes of activity which have a tendency to dissolve personality, e.g. humility, contentment, slavish obedience, modes of human action which have been erroneously dignified by the name of virtue. On the other hand, high ambition, generosity, charity, and a just pride in our traditions and power fortify the sense of personality. Personality, being the dearest possession of man, must be looked upon as the ultimate good. It must work as a standard to test the worth of our actions. That is good, which has a tendency to give us the sense of personality. That is bad, which has a tendency to suppress and ultimately dissolve personality. By adopting a mode of life calculated to strengthen personality, we are really fighting against death, a shock which may dissolve the arrangement of forces we call personality. Personal immortality then lies in our own hands. It requires an effort to secure the immortality of the person. The idea I have dropped here has far-reaching consequences. I wish I could have time to discuss the comparative value of Islam, Buddhism and Christianity from the standpoint of this idea, but unfortunately I am too busy to work out the details. 16. History. History is a sort of applied ethics. If ethics is to be an experimental science like other sciences, it must be based on the revelations of human experience. A public Declaration of this view will surely shock the susceptibilities even of those who claim to be orthodox in morality but whose public conduct is determined by the teachings of history. 17. Metaphysics. I confess I am a bit tired of metaphysics. But whenever I happen to argue with people, I find that their arguments are always based on certain propositions which they assume without criticism. I am, therefore, driven to examine the value of these propositions. The practical in all its shapes drives me back to the speculative. It seems to me to be impossible to get rid of metaphysics altogether. 18. Fanaticism. All nations accuse us of fanaticism. I admit the charge. I go further and say that we are justified in our fanaticism. Translated in the language of biology, fanaticism is nothing but the principle of individuation working in the case of group. In this sense, all forms of life are more or less fanatical and ought to be so if they care for their collective life. And as a matter of fact, all nations are fanatical. Criticize an Englishman's religion, he is immovable, but criticize his civilization, his country, or the behavior of his nation in any sphere of activity and you will bring out his innate fanaticism. The reason is that his nationality does not depend on religion, it has a geographical basis, his country. His fanaticism then is justly roused when you criticize his country. Our position, however, is fundamentally different. With us, nationality is a pure idea. It has no material basis. Our only rallying point is a sort of mental agreement in a certain view of the world. If then our fanaticism is roused when our religion is criticized, I think we are as much justified in our fanaticism as an Englishman is when his civilization is denounced. The feeling in both cases is the same though associated with different objects. Fanaticism is patriotism for religion, patriotism. Fanaticism for country. 19. Patriotism. Islam appeared as a protest against idolatry. And what is patriotism but a subtle form of idolatry, a deification of a material object? The patriotic songs of various nations will bear me out in my calling patriotism a deification of a material object. Islam could not tolerate idolatry in any form. It is our eternal mission to protest against idolatry in all its forms. What was to be demolished by Islam could not be made the very principle of its structure as a political community. The fact that the Prophet prospered and died in a place not his birthplace is perhaps a mystic hint to the same effect. This entry was incorporated into the paper The Muslim Community the same year, 1910. The passage read, "To my mind the feeling of patriotism which the national idea evokes is a kind of deification of a material object, diametrically opposed to the essence of Islam, which appears as a protest against all the subtle and coarse forms of idolatry." The very next lines embody the substance of the previous reflection. Fanaticism. 20. Justice. Justice is an inestimable treasure, but we must guard it against the thief of mercy. 21. Muslim solidarity. From what I have said above on Islam and patriotism, it follows that our solidarity as a community rests on our hold on the religious principle. The moment this hold is loosened, we are nowhere. Probably the fate of the Jews will befall us. And what can we do in order to tighten the hold? Who is the principal depositary of religion in a community? It is the woman. The Mussulman woman ought to receive sound religious education, for she is virtually the maker of the community. I do not believe in an absolute system of education. Education, like other things, is determined by the needs of a community. For our purposes, religious education is quite sufficient for the Muslim girl. All subjects which have a tendency to dewomanize and to demuslimize her must be carefully excluded from her education. But our educationists are still groping in the dark. They have not yet been able to prescribe a course of study for our girls. They are, perhaps, too much dazzled by the glamour of Western ideals to realize the difference between Islamism, which constructs nationality out of a purely abstract idea, i.e. religion, and Westernism, the very lifeblood of whose concept of nationality is a concrete thing, i.e. country. 22. The German nation. In the economy of nature, each nation has a function allotted to it. The function of the German nation is the organization of human knowledge. But they have recently started on a commercial enterprise which may give them an empire, but they will have to suffer the displacement of a higher ideal by the all-absorbing spirit of trade. 23. The modern Hindu. It is extremely interesting to watch the birth and growth of a new ideal among a people. Oh, the enthusiasm it inspires, and the force with which it attracts all the energies of a people to one common center. The modern Hindu is quite a phenomenon. To me, his behavior is more of a psychological than a political study. It seems that the ideal of political freedom, which is an absolutely new experience to him, has seized his entire soul, turning the various streams of his energy from their wonted channels and bringing them to pour forth their whole force into this new channel of activity. When he has passed through this experience, he will realize his loss. He will be transformed into an absolutely new people, new in the sense that he will no longer find himself dominated by the ethical ideals of his ancestors, whose sublime fancies have been a source of perpetual consolation to many a distressed mind. Nations are mothers of ideals, but ideals, in course of time, become pregnant and give birth to new nations. 24. Right and might. Philosophy is the logic of right, history the logic of might. The canons of this later logic appear to be more sound than those of her sister logic. 25. The future of Afghanistan. The verdict of history is that buffer states have never been able to form themselves into great political units. So was the case with Syria, a buffer state between the empire of Rome and that of the Persians. It seems difficult to forecast the future of Afghanistan. 26. Life as criticism of poetry. Matthew Arnold defines poetry as criticism of life. That life is criticism of poetry is equally true. 27. European Christianity. In the sphere of human thought, Muhammad, Buddha, and Kant were probably the greatest revolutionaries. In the sphere of action, Napoleon stands unrivaled. I do not include Christ among the world's revolutionaries, since the movement initiated by him was soon absorbed by pre-Christian paganism. European Christianity seems to me to be nothing more than a feeble translation of ancient paganism in the language of Semitic theology. 28. Christ and Spinoza. The Jewish race has produced only two great men, Christ and Spinoza. The former was God incarnated in the Son, the latter in the universe. Spinoza was only a completion of the greatest teacher of his race. 29. Aristotle. I have the greatest respect for Aristotle, not only because I, living in the 20th century, know him much better than the older generations of my community, but also because of his vast influence on the thought of my people. The tinge, however, of ingratitude revealed in his criticism of Plato's doctrine of ideas withholds me from giving him my fullest admiration. I do not deny the truth contained in his criticism of his master's views, but I detest the spirit in which he chooses to approach them. 30. The madness of Nietzsche. There are strange inconsistencies in the nature of man. If I marry a prostitute, I indicate thereby that I do not object to such nasty alliances. But if you make my conduct the subject of a story, I take it ill. I condemn in theory what I permit in practice. The philosophy of Nietzsche, at least in the domain of ethics, is an attempt rationally to justify the conduct of Europe, yet this great prophet of aristocracy is universally condemned in Europe. Only a few have realized the meaning of his madness.